Hello, I'm Barry, and welcome to Rusty Nail and Friends, where children and grown-ups can enjoy a quiet story together. Welligog Green to the Rescue, Part 1. Since losing his partner to the mud on Morecambe Beach, Welligog Green has been terrified of water. Can he conquer his fear when a flood threatens disaster? Shall we find out? Now you may be wondering why Morris Wainwright would bother to keep an old green Wellington boot. You never know, Morris would say. I may just come across a left-handed boot sometime. Welligog Green, however, was a rather grumpy old boot, prone to grinding his teeth when he got upset, so the others were quite happy for him to hang from his hook in the shed and sleep most of the time. But Rusty would say they must try to be patient with him and remember that he'd lost his left-footed partner when she got stuck in the mud on Morecambe Beach. However, Morris Wainwright had firmly refused to throw him in the dustbin, hoping that he may just come across another Wellington about the same size. But to be fair, Welligog was always happy to help if the others asked him to catch raindrops dripping through the shed roof, and he would let them hide inside his foot if Morris Wainwright was in a particularly bad mood. But here was one occasion when he really was able to show just how useful he could be. But that was after they'd managed to persuade him to dip his foot back into the water and forget about the beach at Morecambe, at least for a while. It was one cold winter day, and sparkling white frost had covered the ground for several weeks. Inside the garden shed it was freezing, and all they wanted to do was huddle together inside the scrap box to keep warm. Sprocket was so cold that young Pinion said if he touched him his fingers tingled and stuck fast as if they were glued. Even Springerling had stopped bouncing around and just hung limply from his hook, quivering like a jelly. Then one morning, as Rusty Nail was polishing the brass knocker on the scrap box door, just to keep warm, a beam of golden sunlight peeped in through the shed window and bathed the bench in cool yellow light. She squinted at its brilliance and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Come on, you lot," she shouted to the others. "I'll race you to the window ledge. Look, the sun's decided to shine." The old spider was happy to join them, stretching each leg in turn as she slowly emerged from the upturned flower pot. "Go and knock on Peter Verney's box, Pinion," said Rusty, "and tell him the sun's come out." Springerling and the two-faced nuts soon joined the others, running about in the warm sunshine on the ledge below the window, watching the shrubs and trees in the garden slowly discard their winter covering of silver crystals. "I think spring's here at last," said Peter, tapping his stick against the window pane. "Do you really think so?" replied Rusty, smiling. "Then we must start spring cleaning and ask the old spider to spin some new curtains for the scrap box windows." "I bet the frogs in Morris's pond will be happy," interrupted Sprocket. "It can't be much fun for them, slipping and sliding about on the ice." It wasn't very long before Wingsy remarked how quiet it seemed, saying that he hadn't heard Morris Wainwright or his wife shouting at each other for several days. "Now that is strange," said Rusty. "And look, I can't see his motorbike. He usually leans it against the fence, so I wonder if he's gone away." "Yes," replied Peter. "I bet he's taken his wife on a winter skiing holiday." They all nodded and agreed and decided that if that was the case, now would be an ideal time to start the spring cleaning before Morris returned and began throwing bits of oily engine all over the bench. The following day was even warmer and soon melted the thick ice on the pond. It also prompted drops of water to drip from the shed roof and splash on the bench, forming little pools. "I don't like this very much," shouted Peter. "This could turn a fellow rusty," he continued, wiping away the spray from his legs, "or seize up my moving parts if I'm not very careful." "Not to mention my threads," blurted the two-faced nut. "Whatever can we do, Rusty?" "Nothing," she replied. "Can't you see that the whole world is thawing out? In a few days everything will be back to normal, and just as dry as it used to be. We just have to be patient and wait for the ice to melt." Peter Verney was not impressed and stomped off across the bench to his polished box, snapping the lid shut after him. But they could still hear him mumbling something that sounded like, "Well, when it does, please let me know." Welligog Green, who had been listening, yawned and grunted. "I don't know what all the fuss is about. After all, it's only water." "Well, you can't go rusty," snapped Springerling, "being made out of rubber." "No, but I can perish," blurted Welligog, slapping his hand onto his large foot. "I've seen it happen." "Hush a moment, you two," whispered Wingsy. "Can anyone hear that strange hissing noise? I think it's coming from somewhere outside." They all pressed their ears against the window. "I can," said Rusty. "It sounds as if it's coming from Morris Wainwright's house." But at that moment the hissing sound turned into a loud roar, and slates from Morris's roof flew into the air on top of a huge fountain, just as if a whale had swum into Morris's loft and was spouting water as hard as it could. They all stood and stared in amazement as the water cascaded down the roof, pouring over the gutter and dropping like a white waterfall onto the patio chairs below. It was soon gushing in an angry torrent down the stone steps onto the new, sunken lawn, turning the whole garden into a lake. They watched the frogs scamper onto the lily pads as the water poured into the fish pond, and soon Sprocket became convinced that he would hear water lapping against the side of the shed. Then, with a sudden lurch, the shed began to rock gently to and fro, before floating like a huge galleon across the grass, becoming wrecked on the jagged stone wall around the ornamental pond. "His pipes have burst," said Rusty in a subdued voice. "The whole place will soon be under water," shouted Sprocket. "Whatever shall we do?" They ran across to Peter Verney's box and began hammering on the lid. "Peter! Peter!" shouted Rusty. "Something terrible has happened." Suddenly the lid flipped open and a weary-looking Vernier poked out his head. "Whatever is all this confounded noise about?" he yawned. "Can't a fellow get any peace around here?" "A pipe's burst in Morris Wainwright's house, and water is shooting everywhere," gabbled Rusty. "It's flooded the garden. Look," interrupted Springerling, pointing towards the window. "Flooded the garden?" gasped Peter, scrambling out of his box and clambering up the bench, which was now leaning at a steep angle. "Gosh," he explained, "the shed's floated off its base and onto the garden, and now I think we're sinking." "Sinking?" screamed Pinion in a high-pitched voice. "What, like the Titanic?" "Don't start panicking," shouted Wingsy, who pretended to know all about the sea and ships. "All we need to do is launch the lifeboat." "The lifeboat?" repeated Sprocket. "What lifeboat? We haven't got one." "Then Welligog Green will have to do," replied Wingsy. "He should be able to float quite well." "Float?" boomed Welligog, who didn't much like the sound of being a lifeboat. "I've forgotten how to float," he went on, "and I really don't like water much any more." "But this is an emergency, Welligog," said Rusty. "And besides, it's quite impossible to forget how to float." "That may be so," replied Welligog. "But just remember what happened to my partner when she started messing around in water." "But she had Morris Wainwright's foot inside, and it was muddy," began Sprocket in a measured sort of tone. "Look, you would be doing us all a great favour, Welligog," began Peter Verney. trying to remain calm. "Can't you see that the floor is already awash? And look, water's already pouring in through the knotholes in the wall." "Oh, if I really must," snapped Welligog sulkily, flipping himself off the nail and landing with a splash on the shed floor, where he began to bob up and down like a cork. "But only because it's an emergency." However, after a few minutes, he appeared to be enjoying himself. "Floating's not as bad as I thought it would be," he began, in a very confident-sounding voice. "All aboard who's coming aboard." A faint grin began to creep across Welligog's face as he started manoeuvring himself, using his large hands as oars. Rusty and the others lowered themselves down into Welligog using the string that Peter Verney had tied to the vice. "Are we all present and correct?" began Peter, who said that he thought he should be the captain as he knew the most about navigating. "Yes," replied Sprocket, "but there is just one problem." "Problem?" blurted the captain, poking his head out of the welly and glancing around, using a rolled-up playing card as a telescope. "What problem is that?" "Well, the shed door's closed, for one thing," replied Rusty. "So how do you propose sailing out? We haven't got a key." "Easy peasy," shouted Welligog, as he paddled towards the door. "We'll go through the hedgehog flap." And with that, Welligog Green held up the flap with one hand and pulled himself through with the other. Once outside, it was like being on a boating lake, and they were all leaning over the edge as Welligog began sculling across the water, using his big hands, creating a huge bell wave and shouting, "This is the life, the only possible life for a Welligog boot." The frogs sitting on the lily pads where the pond used to be all started cheering and waving their hands in the air each time Welligog sailed past, until young Pinion said that he felt seasick, and Sprocket asked the captain to put into port by the steps leading up to Morris Wainwright's kitchen door. "Quite right, Sprocket," said Peter Verney. "After all, we're not here to enjoy ourselves." "Certainly not," replied Rusty. "We must try to save Morris's house from being flooded." "And our shed," blurted the two-faced nut, "before it floats off down the street." "And how do we intend to do that?" began Welligog, who only wanted to show off to the frogs by paddling around the pool as fast as he could. "By stopping the water shooting out of his roof, of course," snapped Peter, who was beginning to lose his patience with the silly Wellington boot. "Then what do we have to do, Rusty?" said Sprocket. "To stop the water, I mean." "We find Stopcock. He'll know exactly how to stop it," replied Rusty. "You must remember that day when Morris was fixing the kitchen lino down with tin tacks." "Tin tacks?" interrupted Peter. "I can't possibly imagine what tin tacks have to do with Stopcock, whoever he is." "Well, it was a very hot day," continued Rusty, "and Morris couldn't find anywhere to hang his jacket, so he hammered a nail into the kitchen wall." "Oh, I see," said Peter. "The nail went through a water pipe and flooded the kitchen." "No, it didn't," replied the two-faced nut. "He fixed his new lino down with tin tacks. Then he sat down on the doorstep and drank 2 cups of tea." "So what has all this got to do with Stopcock?" repeated Peter impatiently. "Well, it must have turned cool," began Rusty, "because Morris decided to put his jacket back on and then have another cup of tea." "What happened to the nail?" queried Peter, beginning to wish he'd never started this conversation. "Oh, the nail," said Sprocket, looking puzzled. "Well, nothing, but the tin tacks began popping out and little fountains appeared all over the kitchen floor." "You see," said Pinion, who had been trying his hardest to keep up with the story, "Morris had made lots of little holes in the water pipe under the floorboards." "And Stopcock?" shouted Peter. "What about Stopcock?" "Well, that's when Morris began racing up and down the pavement," replied Rusty, shouting, "Stopcock! I must find that Stopcock!" until he discovered him under a little iron trapdoor, said the two-faced nut excitedly. "What, hiding?" snapped Peter. "Oh, no, not hiding," replied Rusty. "He lives there, and he helped Morris stop the water pouring into his kitchen. So I know he can help us, if we can only find him again." After a few minutes, Springerling discovered a small iron trapdoor set in the pavement, with stopcock cast into the metal. "This must be where he lives," shouted Springerling excitedly, while bouncing up and down on the little square lid. "Well, hurry up then," shouted Peter. "Knock as loud as you can." He kicked a large stone over to where Sprocket stood, tapping on the lid with a lolly stick. But just as Sprocket began striking the lid with the stone, they became aware of a loud wailing noise, and gazed in amazement as a huge red fire engine came roaring up the street with its blue lights flashing, and screeched to a halt outside Morris Wainwright's front door. "Flippin' heck!" screamed Sprocket, as one of the firemen flicked open the stopcock's lid, sending him tumbling into the hawthorn hedge, while Peter and the others leapt into the long grass to avoid being trampled under the fireman's big yellow boots. "Oh, just listen to Stopcock squealing," said Rusty, gripping young Pinion's arm and covering his ears with her other hand. "What a bully! Look," replied Sprocket. "Now he's twisting Stopcock's nose with that big iron bar." But to their surprise, instead of howling, Stopcock began to giggle, louder and louder, as if he was really enjoying every moment, until with a big sigh and a loud hiss, he suddenly went quiet. "Look!" shouted Peter. "The water's stopped shooting out of Morris's roof." Rusty couldn't resist peeping into Stopcock's house, just to see if he was all right, and perhaps thank him for turning off the fountain. But he just lay there with a contented grin on his face, with a big iron bar still fixed firmly to the end of his nose. "Thank you so much, Mr. Stopcock," whispered Rusty, not wishing to disturb him. Smiling up at the daylight he hadn't seen for such a long time, he mumbled, "Oh, I don't know. I don't do very much, I'm afraid, and that I don't do very often." And with that he closed his eyes and appeared to drop off to sleep. "Now come along," said Peter impatiently. "Welly will be wondering what's happened to us." But as they reached the top of the steps, hoping to find him still sculling up and down the lake, they were amazed to discover instead a big muddy patch of ground, and Welligog firmly stuck in the middle. The frogs and some toads were sitting on the edge of the ornamental pond, which had now reappeared, screaming with laughter each time Welligog slapped the ground with his hands, splashing his face with streaks of dirty brown mud as he desperately tried to paddle his way out. However, the harder he splashed and beat the slimy mud, the lower he sank into the soft earth, until quite soon his big flat foot had disappeared completely below the surface. "Oh, look at poor Welligog," said the two-faced nut. "He's sinking into the ground, just like his partner did at Morecambe," continued the other face. "Whatever can we do to save him?" "We must pull him out, of course," blurted Rusty. "But then we'll all get stuck," replied Peter. "Not if the frogs help us, we won't," said Rusty confidently. "After all, they enjoyed watching Welligog rowing round and round the lake." "When it was a lake, you mean," said Sprocket. "And now it's not. They can show their gratitude by pulling Welligog out of the mud," replied Sprocket, instead of giggling at him. "Help! Help!" shouted Welligog in a bubbly sort of voice. "If you don't pull me out soon, it will be too late." "Just be patient," shouted Peter. "We're trying to think how to." But Welligog just kept spluttering and spitting out stones, while repeating, "I told you, this is just what happened at Morecambe." Well, this is dramatic. Will history repeat itself, leaving Welligog trapped in his worst nightmare in the mud? Or will his friends be able to rescue him? Find out in part 2. So come back soon, and until then, sleep well and keep smiling.